Sony has been nice enough to lend us one of their FX6 demo units to get our hands on and shoot some test footage. So this is what we got up to with our very quick 48 hours with the FX6. During our first day with the camera, we got straight into our studio and put it through our regular tests. However, before getting into those, I want to talk about something we noticed during the shooting. And this is the dual base ISO of the camera. In our last video, we said that Sony were not claiming this to be a dual native sensitivity sensor, and at the time, they said it would work similarly to the A7S III. If this was true, it would be using heavy noise reduction and processing trickery to achieve the noise level it has at 12,800 like the A7S III. However, with all noise reduction turned off on the FX6, it does not behave the same as the A7S III. The clip on the left here was recorded at the camera's low ISO setting of 800, and the clip on the right is using the camera's high ISO setting of 12,800 with 4 stops of ND dialed in S-Log3, S-Gamma3.Cine. However, if you zoom in, you can see that noise is significantly worse on the 12,800 clip than the 800 ISO. So I can understand why this can't be classed as a dual base ISO sensor, as performance between the low and high mode is significantly different, unlike the FX9 and the Venice. We shot all of our controlled tests in both low and high mode in XAVCI internally, as well as externally to our Shogun 7 in ProRes RAW HQ. If you compare the raw footage at 12,800 to the internal XAVCI at 12,800, you can see that it does look like chroma noise reduction is being applied internally, but luma noise looks similar across both clips. We also artificially boosted what 4 stops of gain would be like to the raw image to simulate what the sensor could be doing if no processing was happening, just pure gain. For this, we took a raw clip of the camera underexposed by 4 stops and then boosted it in post to the same exposure as our 12,800 internal clip. You can clearly see that the recovered clip looks a lot worse than the internal recorded clip. So even though it isn't being classed as a dual base ISO sensor, Sony do seem to be doing something at a sensor level to improve the performance at 12,800 ISO, and its low light performance is fantastic, especially with some denoising in post. We've asked Sony to elaborate further on what exactly they are doing here to achieve this performance, but have yet to hear back. Personally, I think the way Sony has implemented and spoken about this is really confusing, as in the camera these two ISOs are still labelled as base ISOs, even though really they aren't, and it uses the same system in the menu as the FX9, which means that you can switch your base with any of the custom function buttons. We like using 2 for this while shooting. You can then simply hit it and you can switch between low and high modes, which will change depending on what gamma you're in. So in S-Log3 and both HLG modes, the 2 bases are 800 and 12,800, and in S-Cinetone it is 320 and 5,000. It's good to still have the option, and results at high ISO are still great. It's just worth understanding that noise performance will not be the same between these 2 ISO values. Just make sure to allocate time in post for noise reduction, as this could add a chunk of time onto your post workflow. For our under and overexposure, as well as ISO, we also tested it alongside the Sony FX9, Red Komodo, and Canon C200 Mark III. We shot XAVCI on the FX6 and FX9, R3D HQ on the Komodo, and XF AVC in the C300 Mark III. We didn't shoot RAW with the C300 Mark III because we can see the C70 being compared more to the FX6, and that is limited to recording XF AVC internally. For the under and overexposure tests, we lit for our chart using false color on our Shogun 7, and then kept exposure consistent across the cameras. When I refer to over or underexposure, that is referring to the mid-grade chip, which is third from the right, and Sam's skin is sat roughly 1 stop above that. We shot with our Otus 55mm across all 3 cameras at 25p ISO 800. For underexposure, we lit for f2 and then closed down the lens a stop at a time until we hit 6 stops under. We shot the FX6 at both its low and high ISO settings, using ND to correct for the 4 stops change in exposure. The FX6 at its base ISO of 800 performs well, with good performance down to 3 stops underexposed. With 4, it starts getting a bit noisy, but this could be usable with some noise reduction. At 5 stops under, colour shifts slightly and noise is very heavy. At 6, it's unusable. In comparison, the FX9 shifts more green, and it looks like there is a little less chroma noise reduction than the FX6. It also looks like it holds colour better as you stop down. The C300 Mark III shifts more magenta as you stop down and struggles holding colour accuracy, really struggling in the blues. If you want to see how the C300 Mark III performs when shooting in RAW, you can head over to our video looking at that via the link in the description. The KOMODO holds colour well down to -4, but is very noisy, shifting green as you go down the range. The KOMODO features no in-camera noise reduction, so you'll need to run a pass on this to get good results. For our overexposure tests, we pushed the cameras to go 6 stops over. We lit for f11 and then opened up the lens a stop at a time until we hit 6 stops over. We then used Resolve to correct the image back to its base exposure. At the low sensitivity of 800, the FX6 looks good up to around +3 stops. At +4, colour looks good, but skin is breaking a little bit. At the high sensitivity, it looks very close to the same, with the low mode handling colour a touch better. At +5, skin completely blows out and colours begin shifting. The FX9 basically performs the same, with skin looking a little bit worse at +4. The C300 Mark III performs similar to the FX9 with a little bit worse colour reproduction. The KOMODO holds colour really well 5 stops over, but skin starts to break badly at around 4 stops. With our ISO tests, we lit for T2, ISO 800, and then closed down our lens as we stepped up the ISO range. We shot an S-cinetone with the FX6 all the way up to 409,600 ISO with noise reduction in camera off. All the way up to 51,200, the footage looks pretty clean, with a touch of noise reduction. Even at 102,400, the footage is incredibly usable. Upwards of that, things get a little bit dicey, but detail is held onto well, and colours shift a little bit. We shot at 6400 ISO at both the low sensitivity mode and high, and we can't really see a difference in the noise between the two, so unlike cameras with different base ISO systems, there is no real advantage to switching to the high sensitivity mode to get cleaner images at ISOs above the lower base. Anyway, when compared to the FX9, I would say it performs a little bit better. This is partly due to the clear chroma noise reduction that is happening in camera. With the FX9, I would say the footage is usable up to around 25,600 ISO with some noise reduction, and past that noise gets pretty bad and details start getting a bit muddy. The C300 Mark III and KOMODO don't perform quite at the same level as the FX6 and FX9. The C300 Mark III is usable up to around 6400, 12,800 ISO, whereas the KOMODO is really only usable up to around 1600 or 3200 ISO. So the Sonys really are the kings of high ISO performance. As you can see from our chart here, the sensor does suffer from some aliasing, but this is to be expected. And again, as to be expected, it gets better as you shoot in lower resolutions. As we normally do with our camera reviews, we shot some slow motion using controlled light in our studio of us dropping some coffee beans into an espresso cup full of coffee. We shot at both 4K 120 and Full HD 240 frames per second in XAVCI. The slow motion looks fantastic with enough light. However, one thing we noticed with the Full HD 240 clips was there were lines across our clip. After some more testing, this was produced by our Forza 500 light when it was dimmed, so this isn't a camera issue. Other than that, the footage looks really detailed and will be a very popular option for people wanting to shoot with it. The 4K 120 looks especially great. Rolling shutter is handled very well out of the FX6, even in its full frame modes. When we get some more time with the camera, we want to measure this properly, so if you want to see that in a follow-up video, let us know. The FX6 features the same ND filter system as the FX9, which is awesome to have in camera. Looking at the performance of the NDs, we shot all the way from 2 stops to 7, a stop at a time while opening up the lens to keep exposure consistent. The NDs do a really good job at keeping colours consistent with only minor shifts in colour that should not be noticeable for the most part. So not only is the electronic nature of it incredibly convenient and versatile, but the NDs also perform really well. The FX6 features a 12G SDI out that is capable of outputting 16-bit RAW at the camera's base frame rates. We weren't sure if the camera was going to have this feature unlocked, as the FX6 we had was an early model, but our Shogun 7 worked with it straight away. It's really quick and easy to put the camera into RAW mode, of which you have 2 of, either just RAW or RAW and XAVCI. With RAW and XAVC, you can set the camera up to output and trigger the Shogun 7 when you hit the record button on the camera, and you can record internally at the same time. This was really handy for us, as it means we have lots of footage to compare. The ProRes RAW shots look really nice and detailed in Premiere Pro. We have put a few shots to download via the link in our description. We shot 5 of the different internal formats to compare image quality across them. These were full frame XAVCI DCI 4K, full frame XAVCL UHD, Super 35 XAVCL 1080p, full frame XAVCL 1080p, and full frame XAVCI at 1080p. Unsurprisingly, the full frame XAVCI DCI 4K footage looks the most detailed, but the more compressed and lower resolution imagery are still very usable. What you shoot in though will come down to the needs of your production. The FX6 features the same gyro metadata based IBIS as the FX9. This means that you can bring clips into Catalyst Browse and stabilize the footage. How good this works is pretty hit and miss though. Some footage works really well and some clips look awful. But how does it compare to Resolve's built-in stabilizer and Premiere's warp stabilizer? We took the same clip that works really well in Catalyst Browse and popped it into each program. One benefit of the Catalyst Browse method is the speed that the clip is processed, which is much faster than the other two programs. Resolve is no slouch though, and manages to analyze the clip much faster than Premiere's warp stabilizer. I would say for this clip, Catalyst does the best job, but Resolve is very close to it, with Premiere having some of its classic warp artifacts which make it a bit of a pain to work with. So overall, the metadata-based stabilization workflow of Catalyst does produce some good results, but I think this tech will really shine once it is implemented into other programs so you don't have to add another step to your workflow. Currently, it's nice to have, but how practical it is for a workflow comes down to a case-by-case basis. Clear image zoom is a digital zoom that Sony have featured in many of their stills and video cameras, and it's a great way to get a little more out of your lenses. Sony hasn't gone into a huge amount of detail on how they do this, but they have stated that you shouldn't be losing any image quality while using it, which we need to get our hands back on the FX6 to test and see how much this does affect image quality. You can assign it to the rocker on the top of the handle or to the one on the side handle. However, one thing you can also use this for is to use Super 35 lenses on the camera while still being able to shoot in 4K modes. Here you can see me using a Tokina 11-16mm lens on the FX6, and the lens doesn't cover the full sensor. However, all we need to do is zoom in a little bit and boom, you have coverage. This is really handy if you have any Super 35 lenses you still really want to use on your FX6, but this definitely isn't a replacement to a true Super 35 4K mode. Audio is a crucial part of cameras in the FX6 market, as having the ability to monitor and record multiple channels of good quality audio while operating the camera will not only reduce your gear footprint, but also make your life easier in post-production. As you expect from a Sony FS or FX camera, the preamps used with the XLRs here are great, and audio from our Sennheiser MKE600 sounds fantastic. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. We also shot with the internal scratch mic, which may be worth having on as an absolute last resort, but should never be used as a primary audio capture. One interesting piece of feedback I have seen online is the lack of an audio input when the camera's top handle isn't attached. This would have been nice for Sony to have included, and it would be awesome for them to release some kind of accessory to get around this when shooting with a gimbal, for example. Another thing to note is, unlike the A7S III, the FX6 will not record audio while in slow and quick mode, just in regular movie mode. At the end of the first day, we headed into central London to capture some low light footage and get a feel for the camera in a run and gun kind of scenario. We grabbed a handful of BPU batteries and Sony's beautiful 24mm f1.4 prime and the 16-35 f2.8 G master, as well as our trusty Sigma 24-70 2.8. We walked around for a few hours just shooting whatever we could see. The form factor of the FX6 really is great for these scenarios where you want a small camera package to not attract attention without compromising on ergonomics and usability. We shot at both the camera's low sensitivity mode and high, and images look great across both. However, you can see the increased noise at 12,800, but with some noise reduction, the images look great. Our second day with the camera consisted with me exploring it more at home, as well as travelling down to Leaf Hill with Joe and his girlfriend Kathleen, who kindly modelled for us. The weather was truly horrendous, and of course my umbrella broke within a few minutes, which made things a bit more difficult. The camera didn't skip a beat the entire day though, even with the huge amount of rain. We did get lucky with some mist and dry patches, but let us know what you think of the footage in the comments below. The image out of the FX6 is so much better than that from the FS5 Mark II. It's honestly such an improvement. People wanting to upgrade from their aging FS5 will be very happy with what this camera can capture. Otherwise, you get the same excellent usability and form factor, which makes using the camera an absolute joy. We processed all of the footage through Resolve. Playback on our systems was good, with some drop frames here and there, but for editing and color grading, performance was more than adequate. The footage looks really good. Sony have done a great job at improving the color over the past FS series cameras, and it sits in line nicely with the FX9. As we mentioned earlier, you can turn off in-camera denoising, so you can apply and tweak it in post. You have 3 levels: low, medium, and high. We shot all of our test footage with it off, and all denoising was done in Resolve. We normally suggest doing this and then denoising your footage in post for the most part for the best results. However, with the FX6, it may be worth applying some in-camera, as it does a good job. And with the compression of XAVC, it may be worth doing before you hit that compression. With noise reduction off, straight out of camera, the footage does have a fair bit of noise to it, but a pass-through Resolve's denoiser, or even better something like Neat Video, and you will have some really usable images. Let us know if you'd like us to do a deeper dive into this in the comments below. We mentioned the low power draw in our previous video of just 18 watts, and Sony quote around 105 minutes of recording with a BPU35 when using a very specific setup, and this lines up with how much we experience while out shooting. We had one of Hawkwood's BP98UX batteries to use, and that lasts us well over 4 hours, which is pretty damn impressive, while also providing DTAP outputs for anything you are powering on the camera too. Having such a low power draw on a camera like this is awesome, as it means you can shoot for long periods of time with minimal added weight for batteries. When it comes to the color profiles, we shot our standard chart in the 4 color profiles in the SDR mode: S-Cinetone, Standard, Still, and ITU 709. It's great this camera features S-Cinetone, as for fast acquisition imagery, it looks really nice. The FX6 can be controlled via Sony's content browser mobile app, and that is available on both iOS and Android. Once you've connected to the camera, which is pretty easy, you can switch between a few different functions. Connect is where you can connect to the different cameras available. Monitoring, which gives you a live feed from the camera and allows you to control certain settings of the camera. And Browse, which allows you to view full XAVC files or playback proxy files on your device. You can then also upload or download files from a server that you can define. From the limited time we use the app for, it's not super fully featured, but it's good enough to control the camera and view images if you need to remotely. It was an interesting 2 days with the FX6. I wish we had more time with it so I could have explored and elaborated some of our points a little further, but maybe that's something we can do in future. My thoughts on the FX6 really haven't changed too much. It still offers a fantastic set of features in a really great and usable package. Now let us know what you think of the FX6 in the comments below. Make sure to hit subscribe, and thank you for watching.